itself was thick with unspoken tension. It wasn't the scent of wood smoke or damp earth that hung over these villages, but something far more volatile, the musk of creeping anxiety. Life in the medieval countryside was already a struggle, punctuated by the unpredictable whims of weather and the unrelenting grip of famine. To survive, communities relied on deeply intricate webs of mutual dependence, a shared labor, a predictable rhythm dictated by planting and harvest. But when the normal cycles faltered, when the abundance promised by the seasonal turn failed to materialize, the first seeds of suspicion found purchase in fertile ground. These were not sudden, dramatic revelations. They began as mere whispers. A stray goat that died inexplicably, its wounds suggesting something unnatural. An unusually rapid decline among the livestock that resisted the skilled healer's poultices. Or perhaps it was simply a harvest that yielded meagerly, not due to drought, but due to some inexplicable blight that choked the root of the field just before maturity. Such small deviations from the expected order were easily absorbed into the rough tapestry of peasant life. They were attributed to bad fortune, bad luck, or simply the harsh indifference of nature. But as those anomalies accumulated, the sickly patch in the cornfield, the inexplicable fever that targeted only the most prosperous family, the silence of a local well that seemed too profound, a pattern began to emerge. These isolated incidents refused to be categorized simply as misfortune. They started whispering of agency. They whispered of malice. The common remedy for such existential discomfort was narrative construction. When events defy simple explanation, humanity abhors a vacuum and rushes to fill it with potent stories. And the simplest, most compelling story available in that desperate cultural context was one of human interference, malevolence, disguised as fate. The whispering wasn't initially about grand conspiracies. It was about local friction points. It centered on the edges, the outsider who carried too much knowledge, the woman whose medicinal expertise verged upon seeming mastery, or the relative who simply possessed a slightly more vibrant piece of land. These were people whose competence exceeded the established communal norms, and in a community already stressed by scarcity, exceptionalism was quickly interpreted as suspicion. The local fear operated on an intellectual whim. If natural causes could no longer account for suffering, then supernatural ones must be responsible. This leap from correlation to conspiracy is where the tragedy truly begins. It is a catastrophic failure of rational thought built upon foundations of exhaustion and want. The first suspicions were therefore always hushed, passing between neighbors across a low fire, veiled in coded language designed to protect those who still held onto shreds of community goodwill. They would complain not merely about the symptoms, the failing crop, the persistent sickness, but about the root cause, some unnamed entity that had upset the delicate balance of divine and terrestrial law. People began looking at each other differently. Neighbors, once bound by generations of shared hardship, started observing flaws they hadn't noticed before. Every slightly unusual moment received a spectral reading, Every unexplained death was mentally cross-referenced with the lives of those deemed different. The seeds were sown not in grand halls of power, but in the quiet anxieties of hearth and home, nourished by hunger and reinforced by rumor. And once suspicion takes root, a slow, creeping vine, choking out common sense, it requires only a slight breeze of panic to begin its methodical ascent toward full-blown hysteria. After the unsettling seeds of suspicion had taken root in the damp earth of medieval villages, casting long shadows from misfortune onto innocent lives, the resulting anxiety did not simply dissipate. It mutated, taking physical form and attaching itself to those who possessed specialized knowledge. This is the story of the herbalist's dilemma. Where folk medicine met festering fear, the line between healing and heresy became frighteningly thin. In a world governed by unpredictable seasons and capricious illnesses, human understanding was primitive. When the natural remedies offered in apothecaries failed, people turned to those on the fringes, the midwives who guarded secrets of birth, the field healers whose knowledge extended beyond the accepted canon, and the herbalists who knew the poisonous cousins of potent cures. These were figures essential to survival, yet their very competence made them suspect. The common perception held that nature's mysteries belonged only to God, or perhaps to those few permitted to interpret divine will through Scripture. To wield knowledge independently, to mix a poultice from woodland roots that defied standard medical texts, or to predict the cycle of fever based on moon patterns, was often interpreted not as skill, but as usurpation. It was seen as drawing power from sources unauthorized by the church or state. The herbalist's remedies were inherently volatile in the eyes of a terrified community. A simple poultice applied for stomach pain might contain components that could, if misused or misunderstood, be construed as agents of corruption. The local knowledge of medicinal flora was not catalogued within university cloisters. It lived orally, passed down through generations who operated outside established dogma. This decentralized wisdom presented a profound challenge to centralized religious authority. And so began the fatal misunderstanding. To the fearful, any deviation from accepted practice was evidence of malevolent intent. If an illness flared up that no prayer or established remedy could touch, and then someone offered a cure derived from forest whispers, a cure utilizing roots believed to enhance vision, perhaps, or repel invisible vapors, that healer was not merely seen as successful, they were feared. They weren't accused simply of knowing too much about plants. They were accused of accessing the wrong knowledge entirely. Their remedies became suspect because they seemed to bypass the necessary mediation of faith. When a curative effect manifested, people often lacked the intellectual capacity for true attribution. They didn't understand the biochemistry or the efficacy. They only recognized the pattern. Difficulty followed by recovery. And when they linked that recovery too closely with the healer's specific methods, they failed to account for sheer luck, the body's own resilience, or simply the passage of time. The implication whispered in the smoke-filled meeting halls and carried on the biting winds of panic, was dangerously seductive. These healers were not acting out of beneficence. They were performing some kind of profane ritual, drawing power from natural sources to achieve effects that only divine intervention should grant. Their competence wasn't merely medicine. It was viewed as a secret transaction, a defiance against God's designated path of suffering. This dynamic turned the healer into a walking liability. Every successful treatment raised suspicion because success implied knowledge that lay outside conventional understanding. The more ailments they solved, the deeper the fear grew, twisting utility into potential crime. They were placed in an impossible dilemma. To maintain their efficacy meant continually operating in intellectual defiance of established law and doctrine. To cease practicing meant abandoning their community when it needed them most. The resulting accusations rarely began with a direct charge of casting spells. Instead, they started as scholarly disagreements about the origins of a compound or minor procedural infractions during childbirth that seemed too successful, or even just having knowledge that was considered esoteric enough to be unsettling. They were accused not necessarily of harming people directly, but of knowing things, of knowing how nature worked in a way that implied an understanding best left to the infernal powers. This cultural clash between empirical folk wisdom and rigid theological law set the stage for profound tragedy. The authorities did not grapple with the complexity of botanical science or the limits of human physiology. They dealt only in absolutes: sin, damnation, and transgression. Knowledge became a commodity measured by loyalty to established belief systems. Any knowledge that demanded independent thought or relied on empirical observation was flagged as potentially heretical. The system thus positioned itself perfectly for disaster. It did not need proof of malice. It needed merely the appearance of unauthorized efficacy. When a cure worked too well, when a remedy utilized forgotten woodsman wisdom, the official response was to assume that the underlying source of power must be profane. The marginal knowledge keepers were thus systematically undermined, their empirical expertise co-opted and weaponized by the fear they themselves were meant to alleviate. It forced communities into a vicious cycle. Illness generated anxiety. Anxiety heightened suspicion toward knowledgeable outsiders. And this resulting paranoia then attacked the fundamental principles of local medicine itself. The herbalist was trapped in a perfect snare, a pillar of community support whose very existence, based on specialized knowledge, provided undeniable proof to those wielding fear that something profoundly wrong was at hand. The whispers had turned into something much louder, more structured. In the hushed despair of the village square, suspicion no longer relied on chance rumor or circumstantial observation. It demanded a confession. The accusers, having marshaled their collection of local oddities and purported malpractices, the strange poultices, the knowledge of forest roots, the timing of harvests, now pointed towards one single, devastatingly efficient piece of proof. The victim's own tongue became a perverse kind of psychological warfare. The authorities understood that the most valuable testimony was not something they had to dig up, but something the accused would willingly spill out into the accuser's laps, a confession. This process wasn't merely about legal procedure. It was an expertly constructed trap, designed to shatter the very concept of innocent denial. The law, or what passed for jurisprudence in these times, seemed utterly reliant on this willing admission. If you confessed, you were absolved, supposedly, and spared the worst outcomes. But confessing meant damning yourself completely, creating a permanent, tangible record of your guilt. The accuser's goal was not merely to prove malice, but to dismantle the possibility of doubt entirely. And nothing dismantles doubt like the absolute certainty provided by oneself. The pressure exerted in these chambers was immense, suffocating, wrapping around the truth until it couldn't draw a breath. It was a system that preyed on fundamental human needs, the need for understanding, and the desperate desire to avoid pain. The interrogators were masters of psychological distress. They didn't merely ask questions, they engineered despair. They alternated between brutal physical threats, the promise of torture if silence was maintained, and insidious psychological manipulations. They would weave narratives of inescapable doom, suggesting that salvation lay only in full, painful acknowledgement. For the accused, the choice crystallized into an unbearable dilemma. Maintain a stubborn denial and face unimaginable cruelty, or break under relentless pressure and speak the unspeakable truth, a constructed narrative of wickedness that might not even reflect their actual life. The system effectively criminalized silence. If you remained silent, your lack of speech was interpreted as proof of concealment, of guile, of inherent guilt. The process itself became a grotesque performance, transforming the solemn act of giving testimony into an act of irreversible self-destruction. Under duress, people began to confess to crimes they had never committed, weaving elaborate tales involving poisoned milk and pacts with infernal powers, merely because the pain was too unbearable to bear another moment of cognitive dissonance. This reliance on the coerced confession exposed the fragile bedrock of medieval legal theory itself. The integrity of the court rested upon the presumed truthfulness of a statement given under conditions engineered for collapse. It proved that, in this dark crucible, justice was less an impartial pursuit and more a highly exploitable commodity, bought with terror and sold as absolute certainty. The confession thus became the ultimate form of evidence, the most compelling yet entirely unreliable narrative available. The accused's testimony ceased to be about facts. It became a testament to their own breaking point. And once that breaking point was reached, the ensuing pronouncements solidified the witch's identity for all time. Irrevocably wicked, fundamentally guilty, and beyond any possibility of redemption. The village had witnessed what reason could not stomach. In the wake of empty grain silos and the persistent whispers about unnatural illnesses, Suspicion had evolved far beyond mere rumor or crop blight. It was now a structured suspicion, one that demanded evidence, and the nature of proof quickly warped to accommodate the sheer magnitude of fear. The legal process, already relying heavily on self-incrimination and desperate confessions, suddenly found itself faced with an even more nebulous quarry: the immaterial. How do you prosecute a ghost or a memory? This was the emergence of the spectral evidence, the crowning absurdity of the entire horrific enterprise. It was proof rendered entirely invisible, yet legally binding enough to condemn a life. In these trials, the court did not merely consider what happened. It considered what was witnessed, and in a mind gripped by deep spiritual terror and genuine paranoia, nothing could be more powerful than an undeniable vision, the sight of harm where none had physically occurred. The accusers were taught to see patterns, connections, and malice in random coincidence. A sudden chill, an unaccounted for shadow passing across the courtyard, a faint scraping sound at midnight. These became catalogued as signature attacks, hallmarks of demonic presence. These phenomena formed the bedrock of spectral evidence, acts committed through psychic assault, or sometimes simply perceived by highly suggestible minds, and then retroactively categorized as supernatural torture. The testimony thus pivoted away from tangible theft, physical poisoning, or material pacts with infernal powers towards something far more insidious: emotional and spiritual violation. The accusers would take the stand, not to recount facts, but to recreate a terrifying drama of unseen conflict. They described being haunted, subjected to invisible forces that stole their breath, warped their thoughts, and sapped their very vitality. These accounts were accepted into evidence with chilling seriousness, despite the fact that by all observable standards, and even by the most rigorous, unsacred logic, the claims were impossible. The legal machinery, built upon deeply ingrained religious dogma, had simply adopted a new definition of reality. The court became an auditorium for shared hallucinations. If enough people claimed to have witnessed the same spectral entity, a floating head, a shadowy dog, a weeping specter whose very gaze was harmful, the burden of proof shifted entirely onto the accused. The implication was clear: if you do not deny these horrific visions, perhaps you are the source. And if you deny them, then your denial itself must be part of the demonic plot to deceive the righteous court. The legal scholars of the time, grasping for any anchor in a sea of terror, grappled with this impasse. They struggled to fit what was literally unseeable into established canons of law. The resulting doctrine allowed magistrates and inquisitors to accept these subjective experiences, these highly charged interpretations of fear, as definitive proof of guilt. To be accused under the guise of spectral evidence meant confronting an invisible reality that simultaneously confirmed the court's power and exposed its absolute irrationality. The truly damning aspect was not just the alleged attack itself, but the fact that the victim could often corroborate it with other accusers who shared similar, equally bizarre details. This collective manufacturing of proof created a powerful illusion of communal truth. Consider the sheer scope of this delusion. These accusations did not require finding a single tainted poultice or deciphering one cursed book. They required only sustained community anxiety and the malleability of deeply held religious belief. The witches were framed as participants in nightly rituals that involved spectral transportation, astral projection, and the systematic undermining of human sanity. The alleged pacts were thus expanded. They weren't just bargains for souls, but arrangements for continual mental torment delivered via phantom intervention. This systemic acceptance was built upon a core philosophical pillar: the inherent vulnerability of the Christian soul. Because damnation was believed to be absolute, and because the threat of supernatural interference was omnipresent, the capacity to merely perceive such evil held legal weight. The accuser became less a witness and more a channel through which supposed divine revelation flowed, a person validated not by objective fact, but by their perceived connection to a spiritual truth that bypassed all physical senses. They were testifying from a place of absolute terror, and the court treated that terror as infallible data. The irony, dark and suffocating, was that the very act of building the law around the spectral evidence served only to accelerate its demise by making the immaterial actionable in court, by declaring, "I saw it equivalent to you did it." The system devoured its own ability to discern truth. The pursuit of the ghostly allowed real judicial procedure to collapse into ritualistic performance, where accusation itself became the primary act of destruction. The spectral evidence was thus a magnificent monument to mass hysteria, a structure built entirely of shared fear and the profound human inability to reconcile suffering with logical order. It proved that in times of deep collective distress, suspicion does not seek out concrete targets. It invents them, manifesting evil into forms so delicate and impossible they evade all earthly accountability. And what was truly appalling was the complicity required, the participation from religious authorities, legal experts, and ordinary villagers alike, who collectively decided that these terrifying phantoms were more real than justice itself. The accusations had moved far beyond the whispering dark corners of rumor. They were now housed under cathedral vaults, in wooden courtrooms echoing with manufactured certainty. The trials transformed into a perverse spectacle where the deepest theological texts, the stained glass commandments, and the dusty codices of canon law were deployed not to seek truth, but to validate pre-existing suspicion. This was the trial by piety, a catastrophic collision between sacred belief and profoundly flawed human jurisprudence. Here, the divine mandate became the ultimate legal weapon, authorizing the most appalling acts of cruelty in the name of immaculate spiritual order. The process demanded nothing less than absolute surrender to faith, a submission that paradoxically required the utter destruction of self. The court was not merely a mechanism for determining guilt. It was an apparatus designed for purification by fear. Guilt was measured not against observable facts, but against one's perceived distance from God's unforgiving gaze. The authorities who presided over these tribunals were themselves products of deep-seated faith, men and women steeped in Scripture, and the rigid interpretations passed down through generations. They saw the world divided into two irreconcilable halves: the divine order, maintained by orthodoxy, and the profane chaos stirred up by perceived heresy or witchcraft. To even hint at a gap between these poles was to invite suspicion of collusion with the demonic. And so, the law itself bent to spiritual need. The common legal principles, the requirement for material proof, the right to counsel, the presumption of innocence were suspended, dismissed as mere temporal trivialities unworthy of divine concern. Instead, truth became synonymous with confession, and certainty was extracted through a relentless, methodical dismantling of the individual's will. Consider the sheer irony. In the name of absolute piety, the most revered human virtue was practiced an unparalleled lawlessness. The accuser stood cloaked in spiritual authority, reading from passages that described divine wrath, while simultaneously wielding accusation as a profane tool. They spoke of Satan's handiwork, drawing legitimacy from God's own revealed word to justify staking a claim on the lives of their neighbors. The courtroom became a stage for highly specialized theatrical accusations. One might accuse a woman not merely of casting spells, a charge of practical malice, but of having sinned against her sacred relationship with Scripture itself. Her knowledge, if it derived from folk remedy or personal experience rather than approved university theology, was rendered suspect. She was accused of harboring unauthorized wisdom, the kind that existed in the murky borderlands between community oral tradition and codified doctrine. The accusers often exhibited a terrifying blend of genuine spiritual fervor and intellectual absurdity. They could recite passages detailing sin and damnation with breathtaking accuracy one moment, only to spend the next hour detailing how missing flour was a symptom of diabolic pacts, or how knowledge of local forest flora constituted communion with woodland spirits. This juxtaposition is jarring, almost comical in its over-the-top conviction, yet utterly devastating in its consequence. The legal frameworks were constructed on these flimsy pillars. The concept of maleficium, harm done through magic, was formalized and criminalized. It was not enough to simply believe someone was practicing witchcraft. One had to prove it legally within a system that had no standardized definition for the metaphysical, much less a method of proof for invisible malevolence. The accused was trapped in an unbearable psychological corner. To deny the charges meant inviting torture and certain death, confirming their status as enemies of God's grace. To confess meant acknowledging falsehood under duress, sacrificing truth to save one's skin. The legal system masterfully manufactured this dilemma. It required not justice, but complicity. This is where the sheer power of communal paranoia met the alleged authority of divine law. Fear was weaponized into judicial decree. When people were gripped by generalized terror, the fear of plague, of famine, of social collapse, they sought a definitive explanation that transcended simple misfortune. Superstition provided it. An external agent, often personified as a witch or sorcerer, who could be blamed for every blight and every headache. The court proceedings themselves were exercises in performative piety. Every word was weighted with theological gravity, yet the underlying impulse was base human fear. The judges and magistrates, eager to appear zealous guardians of the faith, became enthusiastic participants in an emotional purge. They weren't ruling on evidence, they were enforcing spiritual conformity. And thus, when scripture clashed with superstition, the scale of law tipped violently toward the sensational and the supernatural. The cold rigor of canon law, the legal text, was hijacked by the volatile passion of collective fear, the supernatural. The result was a system that offered conviction and condemnation with absolute, terrifying efficiency, forever blurring the line between divine judgment and human hysteria. The suspicion had crystallized into something physical, tangible. By the time the accusations moved from hushed whispers to formal proceedings, all that remained was a need for conclusive proof, a certainty that only the body could provide. If mere confession could not suffice, if spectral evidence failed to satisfy the fervent jury of piety and panic, then attention turned to the ultimate arbiter, the physical self, the ordeal. It arrived not as a moment of divine revelation, but as a profoundly absurd, pseudoscientific performance designed entirely for the convenience of the accuser and the court. These tests claimed to bridge the chasm between spiritual guilt and material fact. They promised absolute truth, measurable by sweat, stained with urine, or submerged beneath cold water. In these moments, the promise of ultimate knowledge superseded any pretense of justice. The accused was not treated as a defendant facing charges. They were presented as an object under examination, a flawed mechanism requiring rigorous testing to reveal its inherent malice. Consider the dreaded ordeal by hot iron. The logic, if one could call it that, rested on the belief that divine intervention would manifest through the physical reaction of the accused. Whether a searing touch was met with sudden collapse or merely endured with gritted teeth, the interpretation was invariably rigged to confirm guilt. Pain became evidence, suffering ceased to be an ordeal, and transformed into an interrogation tool, a method for forcing the body to betray the spirit. Or there was the infamous water test. The theory was simple enough, yet terrifyingly arbitrary. Purity would repel the witch, guilt would cause her to sink. Whether one floated due to buoyancy or simply struggled against exhaustion, the outcome was framed by interpretation. If she sank rapidly, it proved weight of sin. If she floated, she was presumed deceitful, a deceptive charlatan, who must have used some unseen magic to cheat gravity itself. The tests were less about objective reality and more about demonstrating the intellectual rigor with which local authorities could construct meaning from random bodily responses. The pseudoscience governing these ordeals was remarkable in its sheer lack of foundation. It stitched together bits of medical folklore, distorted interpretations of natural law, and raw religious terror into a tapestry of alleged scientific proof. Sweat, believed to be magically contaminated or indicative of hidden corruption. Urine, analyzed for traces of unnatural elements. Every bodily fluid, every involuntary biological function was designated as an empirical marker of diabolism. These men and women were forced to undergo examinations that would modern practitioners classify simply as cruel, baseless torture. Yet in the crucible of medieval belief, they were regarded with a frantic seriousness bordering on reverence. The performance required total buy-in from the participants, the court functionaries, the accompanying physicians, and the religious observers. They had to collectively suspend disbelief, agreeing that this collection of rites, rituals, and physical stress tests held genuine power to discern divine will. This shared act of intellectual delusion was perhaps the most chilling component. Not just the cruelty inflicted upon the condemned, but the meticulous, professional consensus required to maintain the lie in the face of overwhelming human suffering. When a person passed through these ordeal spotlights, their life had been reduced entirely to their biology. They were no longer people with histories, communities, and flaws. They were collections of bodily secretions measured by density or resistance to fire. The legal system thus established a terrifying precedent that fundamental human dignity could be suspended for the sake of supposed purity. It was proof derived not from witness testimony nor written confession, but from the very fluids streaming from suffering humanity. These ordeals formed the darkest apex of the witch craze. They were moments where belief reached its highest fever pitch, momentarily confusing genuine religious conviction with sheer, systematic psychological torture. The law did not seek truth, it merely sought a spectacle, and nothing was more compelling to terrified minds than blood, sweat, and the cold certainty of scientific-seeming ritual. The village square, once the heart of community life, a place meant for harvest festivals and shared meals, had become something far colder, something echoing with brittle paranoia. What began as whispered concerns within single households quickly metastasized into a contagion of suspicion that consumed the entire social fabric. The gentle, manageable anxieties chronicled in earlier chapters, the strange blight on a patch of rye, the illness passed from one family to another, the disappearance of livestock, had now matured into a collective hysteria, transforming private fear into public policy. Where once there were established boundaries of trust, invisible lines dividing neighbor from neighbor, those lines dissolved completely. Suspicion became the primary currency, exchanged freely in markets and over hearth fires, until the value of human life was reduced to mere atmospheric risk. This transition from personal anxiety to communal purging is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the whole nightmare. It reveals that the true enemy in these witch trials was not merely the accused sorcerer, but the devastating fragility of community itself. When external threats failed, when plague could not be explained by microbes, and famine demanded a culprit beyond bad weather, the human mind possesses a remarkable ability to internalize its failings, turning the collective gaze inward. The weakest links were identified, but quickly the accusations broadened until every single person who hesitated or simply possessed unusual knowledge became equally suspect. The legal framework, already corrupted by suspicion and self-incrimination, found an exponential boost in this environment of pervasive dread. Justice ceased to be a pursuit of truth and morphed instead into a public exercise in enforcing conformity. The criteria for accusation changed from "did you commit harm" to "do you fit the prevailing narrative of community anxiety?" Anyone who deviated the widow who kept too many candles lit, the journeyman who worked on an unconventional schedule, the farmer whose harvest seemed too successful offered themselves up as material evidence, whether they intended to or not. It was a purge that attacked the very concept of shared existence. Neighbors, once dependent upon one another for survival and comfort, now stood across fields from each other, treating mutual acquaintance as circumstantial proof of complicity. Friendship became treasonous. Helpful advice sounded like coded incitement. The community mechanism itself, the elaborate web of reciprocal obligation that held medieval life together, became the greatest instrument of its own destruction. The process was rarely clean or swift. It involved a slow, methodical chipping away at individual reputations, fueled by ritual and fear. Accusations were not simply thrown, they were meticulously constructed using fragments of perceived evidence. Stray hairs found in stockings, circumstantial whispers about forest encounters, the suspiciously timed healing of an otherwise ailing child. Each small detail, devoid of factual weight, was woven into a tapestry of malice that seemed undeniable to those who crafted it and to those who believed it. Consider the sheer absurdity of this systemic breakdown. The charges often demanded not only malevolence, but profound technical expertise in the arcane arts, a knowledge usually reserved for deeply secretive figures, yet accessible enough to be alleged by anyone suffering from a fit of panic. To suspect someone was one thing, to successfully charge them required demonstrating an impossible understanding of human nature and natural law, achieved solely through the combined force of intense emotional fervor and institutionalized panic. The village became a closed ecosystem of terror, where every utterance carried the potential for ruin. The accuser acted as both prosecutor and pyromaniac, their fervent piety justifying the extreme violence required to purge the hidden corruption from their midst. They were not merely reporting crimes, they were performing communal cleansing rituals designed to restore an imaginary balance between man and nature, man and God, and community, and perceived divine wrath. The cycle of accusation thus became a perfect, self-perpetuating engine of cruelty. The initial anxiety, the lack of adequate grain, the unexplained death created suspicion. This suspicion empowered the authorities and surrounding populace to enforce conformity. The enforcement, in turn, exposed more deviants, who then fueled new waves of paranoia among the witnesses, restarting the cycle with greater intensity each time. There was no final conclusion, only an accelerating downward spiral into mutual distrust. The people sought not justice, but catharsis. They wanted the purifying agony of believing they had successfully banished a visible evil, a witch, a curse, a secret conspiracy from their village limits. The resulting deaths were thus framed by the perpetrators not as failures of law or ethics, but as moments of profound spiritual victory. The ultimate tragic lesson illuminated by these localized purges is that when foundational systems of trust collapse under sustained stress, rationality retreats instantly before sheer panic. Human beings, confronting suffering they cannot categorize or solve, whether it is a failed crop cycle or the inescapable passage of plague, will often turn their magnificent cognitive abilities toward finding the simplest, most tangible scapegoat. And tragically, in those dark villages, every neighbor became capable of holding that catastrophic burden. The hysteria that swept through the villages had done its grim work. The screams were over, the pyres cooled, and yet the rot within the legal structures remained undisturbed, a corrosive element feeding off the ashes of human decency. This seemingly inevitable conclusion is where we find ourselves in this chapter, examining the systemic failures, the structural deficiencies in justice that allowed such industrialized cruelty to flourish. It wasn't merely the wickedness of individual men. It was the cynical application of law itself, wielded like a blunt instrument against the fragile lives of the accused. The pursuit of magic, far from being an exception outside the legal purview, had been systematically folded into it, given spurious legality by a desperate confluence of belief and desperation. The medieval legal mind, already grappling with overlapping traditions, common law clashing with canon law, Germanic tribal customs interacting uneasily with Roman jurisprudence, was ill-equipped to handle supernatural panic. The resulting system was not merely compromised, it was fundamentally corrupted from within, creating what we might describe as a perfect legal vacuum. In this void, justice did not simply depart, it dissolved entirely, leaving only the cold framework of accusation and conviction. The core failure lay in the assumption that a written law could govern an irrational emotional outburst. When fear becomes the primary evidence, legal procedure quickly loses its moral center. The accused were often stripped of any semblance of due process. They faced inquisitions rooted not in verifiable facts, but in spiritual suspicion. To prove guilt, one did not need to present objective evidence. One merely needed a confession, a self-incriminating whisper extracted under duress. This created a paradoxical legal trap. The law required certainty, the divine and mundane understanding alike, yet its own mechanisms were perfectly designed to enforce radical uncertainty. Consider the foundational right of the accused, the right to remain silent. In the court of the witch trial, this right was not merely ignored, it was weaponized against them. To plead ignorance or simply to maintain silence in the face of relentless interrogation became tantamount to accepting the narrative that their continued refusal proved guilt by omission. The legal framework thus morphed into a confessionary machine. Torture, far from being a deviation from justice, a grim extracurricular activity for rogue judges, was institutionalized as an essential quasi-scientific tool of discovery. It was presented not as barbarism, but as necessary interrogation medicine, designed to coax the full truth from a reluctant mouth. The physical pain became synonymous with the spiritual revelation. Sweat, urine, forced oaths, all were metabolized by the courts and accepted as legitimate testimonial value, cementing the delusion that suffering could generate empirical data. The judicial body itself operated under an almost breathtaking intellectual hubris. It possessed the authority of established Christian dogma, while simultaneously demonstrating a staggering inability to distinguish between verifiable fact and collective hysteria. Judges, lawyers, and even theological experts became active participants in this systemic denial of justice. They were not merely observing a breakdown of order, they were actively defining what constituted acceptable reality for their community. Furthermore, the law surrounding property disputes and economic hardship provided crucial legal loopholes that accelerated the witch hunts. When harvests failed or livestock perished, local dispute resolution systems often included provisions to prosecute unknown malevolent influences, the neighbor who stole more than just wheat, but stolen vitality itself. This allowed common civil law mechanisms of debt and trespass to be fraudulently adapted for supernatural crimes. The accusation could thus gain a veneer of mundane legality. It wasn't simply witchcraft, but the theft caused by maleficium, which harms the community economy. The result was a legal structure that prioritized spiritual conformity over constitutional justice. Any deviation from the accepted theological narrative, any unexplained death, any unusual sickness, any local quarrel elevated to an extreme was given legal traction until it became proof of pacts and sorcery. This chapter reveals that in their desperate attempts to impose divine order onto a confusing, failing world, the men and women who created these legal precedents fundamentally misunderstood both human nature and the concept of law. They mistook fear for evidence, confession for truth, and institutional authority for moral rectitude. The very notion of justice became contingent not upon adherence to impartial rule, but upon the communal consensus forged through shared terror. The witch trials were thus a profound study in jurisdictional overreach, a perfect confluence where religious zealotry provided the ultimate motive, while flawed common law structures provided the chilling mechanism for execution. They did not merely fail to deliver justice, they created and administered an entirely alternative system of penalty and belief that held no place within true jurisprudence. Only in the suffocating darkness of human desperation. The fire finally cools. The pyre ash settles into a uniform gray blanket over the charred earth. In the silence that follows, there is no reckoning of justice, only the heavy settling of smoke and regret. The grand, terrifying machinery of accusation has ground itself to a halt, yet the noise does not depart entirely. It merely shifts from screams of agony to a deeper, more persistent hum, the sound of collective, unexamined trauma. This is where we find the true aftermath of the witch hunts, in the lingering ghosts of burned memories. The trial ceased because the human capacity for terror does not expire with the final passing of the accused. Instead, it retreats, sinking deep into the bones of a community, leaving behind an insidious residue, a suspicion that no length of law or bonfire could cleanse. Survival became a complicated thing in these villages. For those who lived, they were marked not only by loss, but by complicity. The lines blurred irrevocably between the pure and the guilty, the accuser and the accused, until all sin seemed inherited merely by sharing a meal or drawing breath from the same polluted air. The victors walked away with their spiritual catharsis intact, believing they had purged the malevolent influences of their land and their souls. They carried the false certainty that adherence to dogma, no matter how cruel its application, had somehow restored divine order. But this restoration was a magnificent lie. They learned nothing of objective truth, nor did they ever truly grasp the mechanics of human malice itself. What they gained was a deep, crippling knowledge of their own vulnerability, how quickly rational thought could be suspended by shared fear, and how easily profound piety could justify spectacular brutality. The trauma, therefore, became internalized. It manifested as an almost pathological need for certainty, a craving for tangible enemy that could be pinpointed, dissected, and consumed. The memory of the witch trials did not lead to enlightenment. It led to a rigidification of belief, turning intellectual curiosity into suspicion and skepticism into outright heresy. The survivors were forced to integrate unspeakable atrocity into the fabric of daily life. Children grew up knowing that unexplained misfortune was not an act of nature or simple bad luck, but rather a sign of moral decay requiring preemptive cleansing. The local remedies for blight became less about herbs and more about protective charms against lingering supernatural fallout. The village council meeting, where suspicion once festered over missing livestock or poor harvests, now included unspoken rituals. They were haunted by the ghosts, not merely of the burned bodies, but of the words spoken in their name. She knows too much, or the pact demands it. These phrases became more potent than any law book. Consider the weight of having your reality utterly dissolved and replaced with a consensus of dread when evidence requires you to believe that faint smoke can carry sin, or that an illness must emanate from a corrupted herbal poultice. The struggle is not against an external enemy, but against the very foundations of perception. The law, which had pretended to function on reason and precedent during the peak frenzy, finally receded. What remained was simply social pressure, a terrible consensus. To disagree with the prevailing fear was no longer merely dissent. It was a risk to one's continued existence within the communal fold. This sense of permanent psychic contamination permeated subsequent generations. The suspicion did not dissipate, it mutated. It found new targets and repurposed old accusations. Where once they blamed rootwives for spoiled milk, later centuries might redirect that potent energy toward the corrupt merchant or the politically inconvenient neighbor. The fundamental mechanism, the blaming of the other when times grew lean, remained terrifyingly constant. The true horror, as this chapter reveals, is that the memory of trauma doesn't simply disappear into quiet reflection. It solidifies into dogmatic structure. It becomes a behavioral script passed down through generations. When anxiety strikes, do not seek explanation in nature or science. Seek confession. Demand proof through torture. Assume the enemy wears the face of a neighbor and speaks with the veneer of piety. The long sleep, if there is one, is not peace. It is a hibernation of doubt. The community lives under the perpetual tension that the next passing cloud might carry accusation. The next bad harvest might require cleansing fire. And the deep-seated belief in inescapable spiritual judgment remains an unquenched ember beneath the hearthstones. And so, history moves on, but always carrying the particulate dust of those burnt memories. We are left not with a moral treatise or a cautionary tale easily dismissed, but with a pervasive understanding that human fear, when given legal and religious sanction, is perhaps the most efficient and destructive force imaginable. It is a power far more enduring than any single accusation, whispering quietly from every subsequent age. Believe only in what your neighbor demands you believe, or suffer the fire. The ashes cooled, but the smoke did not dissipate. The stench of burning wood and humanity remained clinging to the villages, a bitter residue that settled over generations like dust. The tragedy of the witch trials was never contained within the pyre itself. It was an atmospheric condition, a prolonged state of communal anxiety. When the final executioner's blood dried on the cobblestones, it did not signal clarity or resolution. Instead, it merely left a vacuum, sucking away the fragile scaffolding of trust and leaving behind a profound, echoing uncertainty. The survivors lived with phantom limbs of guilt. They had witnessed the absolute failure of justice, the triumph of terror over truth, yet the experience offered no moral immunity. How do you survive having seen evil systematized by scripture and law? The answer, often whispered in the deepest hours, was to normalize the abnormality. The witch trials did not end when the burning stopped. They simply transitioned from judicial spectacle to cultural pattern, a deeply ingrained mechanism of suspicion that learned how to feed on ambiguity. We see this mechanism persist across time, like a deep geological fault line awaiting release. The frantic need for an external enemy, something tangible enough to point fingers at, yet amorphous enough to satisfy the collective fear, is perhaps the most enduring echo of the medieval nightmare. If the initial anxiety arose from blight and unpredictable harvests, The subsequent anxieties found their purchase in new realms: unreliable economies, competing ideologies, shifts in global power, or even simply technological disruption. The foundational premise remains unchanged. When life's mechanisms become too complex, too fast, or simply unexplained the human mind defaults to seeking a single, definitive scapegoat. The medieval world found its scapegoats among women, the midwives, the herbalists, the outspoken peasant who dared question the landowner. They were easily visible targets, exceptions to established order. In modern history, the face of the suspected shifts, but the underlying function remains identical. The power dynamics dictate where suspicion lands. The purges that followed burning whispers did not cease when the age of faith gave way to the era of enlightenment. They simply traded one form of magical accusation for another. Sedition, heresy, radical thought, or finally, in our contemporary epoch, invisible threats like economic collapse or global pandemics. Consider the intellectual anxieties. When the established structure of knowledge, be it divine mandate through the church or scientific certainty through academia, is challenged, suspicion finds a receptacle. To question the accepted narrative, to possess an unauthorized degree of understanding, is often interpreted by the fearful crowd not as curiosity, but as conspiracy. The modern echoes are subtle and deeply seductive. We no longer gather in open squares with torches, yet we congregate in digital echo chambers, armed with accusations built on algorithmic certainty and emotional outrage. The architecture of denial is just as solid. The accusation has mutated from the whispered rumor at a village well to the viral post, from pointing at the alleged pact marked by strange symbols to linking an obscure data point to systemic corruption. Both are fueled by the same deep-seated cognitive failure, the overwhelming discomfort with complexity. We yearn for simplicity. We seek the neat, malevolent hand that can account for the chaos of existence. It is far easier to believe a handful of powerful figures are working in concert against us, a secret society, a shadowy cabal, or an unknown geopolitical force, than it is to accept the vast, indifferent sprawl of reality. The pattern is terrifyingly stable. In the medieval village, one needed evidence of magical contract. Today, we need only proof of malfeasance. The methods change from spectral visions to manipulated statistics, but the psychological impulse remains raw. Find someone to blame for what is fundamentally uncontrollable. This pursuit offers a perverse kind of catharsis, a temporary feeling of mastery over an overwhelming world. It teaches us that law itself is merely a tool, not inherently moral, but reflecting the highest and lowest anxieties of its populace. When a society prioritizes immediate ideological conformity over measured justice, the mechanisms designed to protect the innocent, due process, evidence standards, rights, are the first casualties sacrificed at the altar of collective reassurance. The ultimate horror is the realization that we are not immune. The systemic forgetting achieved in those burned villages was temporary. It required time and trauma. But the fundamental human capacity for suspicion, for defining otherness, remains a volatile inheritance. It waits patiently, dormant beneath layers of sophisticated modernity, ready to flare up when the next great uncertainty, the next unexplained blight arrives. The echo is not just faint.